My story wasn't as tragic as some, but it still carried its weight. Before my wife and I tied the knot, we had been together for a couple of years. Everything seemed to be going well until one day she suddenly expressed a desire to see other people, with hopes of possibly rekindling our relationship later. It shattered me. I felt like my world had come crashing down, and I threw myself into work to cope with the pain. A year later, I found out that the guy she left me for had cheated on her. They broke up, and she reached out to me. But I was still hurting too much to even consider talking to her. She ended up going back to him for a couple more months, but it wasn't long before he betrayed her again, and this time, they parted ways for good. Once again, she tried to contact me. And once again, I shut her out. The wounds she had left were still fresh, and I couldn't forget how deeply she had hurt me. After that, she moved on to another guy, and they dated for about 6 months. Unfortunately, things took a darker turn when he became physically abusive, leaving her with bruises. I tried to keep my distance, but one night, I ended up at a party, completely hammered. To my surprise, she was there too, and somehow, we found ourselves back in each other's arms. It wasn't like it was before, not by a long shot. I still loved her, but trust was a different story. I had every reason to be cautious. Despite that, we dated for over a year after that, and eventually, we got married. She moved into my house, a modest place my grandparents had gifted me when I graduated from college. It was small but cozy, tucked away about 10 miles from town down a dusty old road. Living there together brought a mix of nostalgia and uncertainty. The house, while quaint, felt like a reminder of everything we had been through. The walls held whispers of our past, both the joy and the heartache. As we settled into married life, I was determined to make it work, but the shadow of doubt lingered. Would we be able to overcome the scars from our history? Would love be enough to bridge the gaps that had formed between us? Despite my lingering fears, I focused on building a future with her. I worked hard to make the house feel like a home, filling it with memories we could create together. I decorated the living room with pictures from our travels and kept the kitchen stocked with her favorite foods. I wanted her to feel secure and cherished, but I knew that trust wouldn't come easy. As the months rolled on, we faced our share of challenges. There were moments of tension when the past crept in, reminding us of the fractures in our relationship. We went to counseling, hoping to heal the wounds that still throbbed beneath the surface. It was tough work, peeling back the layers of our hearts to confront the hurt and the hope that lay hidden within. Through it all, I tried to remain optimistic. I reminded myself of the love that had brought us back together in the first place. Slowly but surely, we began to find our rhythm. The laughter came back, filling the spaces that had once felt hollow. We learned to communicate better, to be more open about our fears and dreams. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, I turned to her and said, "I know we've both made mistakes, but I believe we can get through this. I want to build a future with you, one that honors our past but isn't defined by it." She looked at me, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want that too, James. I've made my share of mistakes, and I know I have to earn your trust back. But I'm committed to doing whatever it takes." In that moment, I felt a spark of hope. Maybe we could forge a new path together, one that left behind the pain of the past while embracing the possibilities of the future. It was a journey that wouldn't happen overnight, but I was ready to take it step by step, hand in hand, as we navigated the winding road ahead. It felt like everything was falling into place. Sarah and I had agreed to wait at least 3 years before starting a family. Our marriage seemed perfect for the first 2 years. I truly believed we were doing well. But then, history repeated itself. Instead of being honest with me, Sarah decided to bring someone else into our lives without my knowledge. I suspected she knew exactly what she was doing. It was Valentine's Day, a day meant for love and romance. After a half day at work, I picked up flowers and a thoughtful card, excited to surprise her when I got home. As I pulled into the driveway, my heart sank. I recognized the car parked out front, the same one her old boyfriend had driven when she left me the first time. I parked a little way down the street, trying to calm my racing thoughts, and walked the rest of the way to the house. The front door was locked, which was understandable. I made my way around to the back, where we had a key hidden. I entered through the kitchen and crept down the hallway, the atmosphere thick with tension. As I approached the living room, I listened intently, and that's when I heard them. The unmistakable creaking of springs mixed with soft moans reached my ears. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. I carefully opened the door just enough to peek inside, needing to see for myself what was happening. What I saw shattered my world. There was Sarah, my beautiful wife, lying on her back under the covers, her body entwined with Tom's. The covers rose and fell in rhythm with their movements. In that moment, I felt a mix of disbelief and heartbreak. Here was my wife, the woman I loved and trusted, giving herself to someone else, lean and full of life, but all that love was directed at another man. As I stood frozen in the doorway, my mind raced. I couldn't comprehend how everything had changed so quickly. The Valentine's Day I had envisioned, filled with love and connection, was replaced by betrayal and heartache. I felt like a ghost in my own home, a silent witness to the unraveling of everything I held dear. It never crossed my mind to harm anyone. I just wanted her out of my life. Seeing her offer everything that was once mine to someone else was a pain I couldn't have imagined. I had to break up the scene that was unfolding in front of me, so I stepped inside. Annie saw me first, and in a panic, she pulled the covers over her face. Tom jumped out of bed, fumbling to put on his clothes. I stood there silently, watching as the room fell into a heavy stillness, broken only by Annie's muffled sobs from under the covers. Once Tom finished dressing, he looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern, as if he thought I would step aside. But I remained planted in the doorway, even though he was significantly larger than me. Finally, I broke the tense silence. "Aren't you forgetting something?" I asked, my voice steady. He glanced around, clearly puzzled, before looking back at me. I shot him a look that said he was being foolish. "Take her with you. Get her up, get her dressed, and both of you need to get out of here, immediately." At my words, Annie erupted in screams. It took everything in me not to react as Tom reluctantly pulled her from the bed, forcing her into the clothes she had worn earlier that day. I watched as he dragged her out of the house, her cries echoing through the air. Tom had moved back to town to live with his parents, and I informed him over the next few days that I'd be dropping off Annie's belongings at his place. Throughout all of this, Tom didn't say a word. He was a well-liked guy, a bit too charming for my liking, especially considering my wife had fallen for him. I could see him holding her tightly in the car as they drove away, and a part of me felt a flicker of satisfaction knowing that I was putting an end to this. True to my word, I gathered everything of hers I could find and dumped it in Tom's yard. I didn't knock on the door or wait for a response, I simply tossed her belongings out and left. It wasn't until a few days later that I learned she hadn't gone to Tom's place after all. Instead, he took her back to her parents' house, about 60 miles away. Annie bombarded both their home phone and my phone with calls so frequently that I finally unplugged the house phone and changed my number. I had nothing left to say to her. A few days after I dropped her things off at Tom's, her parents drove to my house. Annie was in the car, and when her dad came to the door, I made it clear, "If she gets out of that car, you all need to leave." He told her to stay put, and I could see her face crumple as she started crying again. Both her parents came inside, looking uneasy. They started by apologizing for Annie's actions, but I cut them off, telling them it wasn't their fault. Then they asked what they could do to help us get through this. By the look on their faces, I could tell my answer surprised them. "There's nothing you can do. Annie is damaged goods, and I have no desire to have her back in my life." The weight of those words hung in the air, and I watched as their expression shifted from concern to disbelief. In that moment, I realized that this was my chance to reclaim my life, to move on from the wreckage that had been our marriage. I didn't want to dwell on the pain, I wanted to step into a future that was mine alone. She cheated on me in my own bed, and we're done, I said, my voice calm but firm, leaving no room for argument. I recounted everything, starting from when we first began dating, detailing her behavior that had raised red flags over time. Both Sue and Annie's mom listened, their expressions a mix of shock and sympathy. Sue tried to explain how devastated Annie was, but I couldn't help but snort. She's not nearly as devastated as I am, I shot back. I was the one who had lost the woman I had envisioned building a life with, someone I had planned to raise children with and grow old alongside, surrounded by our grandchildren. As I spoke, tears streamed down my face, and I noticed both of them were crying too. But I made it clear that this wasn't something that could be fixed. Annie needed to move on and find someone else. I mentioned Tom's name, and Sue shot me a dirty look. Annie swore she wouldn't even look at Tom again, let alone be with him, she insisted. Too late, I replied bitterly. She already chose him over me, and that's all there is to it. When they left, they asked me to promise I'd stay in touch with them, concerned about Annie and how she was coping with everything. Their worry only made me shake my head in disappointment. How hard could this really be for her? I muttered under my breath. A week later, George, Annie's dad, called me, pleading for me to talk to her. Apparently, she hadn't eaten since I kicked her out, or at least she had eaten very little. She was naturally lean, and there wasn't much weight for her to lose. George and Sue begged me to reconsider, it was painful to hear them so distraught. She's our baby, George said, his voice breaking. We're worried she might do something harmful to herself. But I had made up my mind. I had her served the following week with divorce papers I had drawn up. We decided to take out of the marriage what we brought in, which wasn't much. I offered half of our savings, nearly $30,000 we had accumulated before we were even married. When George called me again, he was sobbing, just as hard as Annie had been when Tom dragged her from my house. Can you please put this on hold? Just give us both some time to cool off, he pleaded. Annie's even worse now, he continued. She started throwing up the instant she was served, and she still hasn't eaten. We had to call an ambulance, and she's in the hospital now. After we hung up, I felt like I was suffocating. I needed to escape. I quit my job, gave my parents power of attorney to make decisions for me, and rented out my home. Then I left town. The first year was spent in Alaska, working on a fishing boat. The cold air and hard work became my refuge. I found solace in the rhythmic sway of the boat on the ocean, the salty spray of the sea a sharp contrast to the turmoil I had left behind. Each day was a reminder that I was moving forward, away from the heartbreak and the life that had shattered in an instant. In the isolation of the Alaskan wilderness, I began to reclaim parts of myself I thought I had lost forever. I learned to fish, to navigate the waters, and to embrace the quiet moments of reflection. Though the pain lingered, the harsh beauty of my surroundings slowly helped to heal the wounds in my heart. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. In my second year, I kept to myself while working on a fishing boat out of California, chasing after tuna. This job led me to Alaska, where I spent the next 3 years in Prudhoe Bay, toiling in the oil fields. Over the course of 5 years, I lived frugally, banking every penny I earned. By investing wisely in opportunities that my employer offered, I amassed a considerable sum. I wouldn't call myself wealthy, but I had enough saved up to retire comfortably if I managed my funds carefully. Living on just $50,000 a year would allow my investments to continue growing. I also had a stake in a few oil wells, 3 natural gas wells, and half a small fleet of tuna boats. The annual income from those wells was solid enough to keep me afloat. But everything changed after a tragic accident in Prudhoe Bay that made me confront my own mortality. Feeling the weight of those experiences, I decided to leave it all behind and return to my hometown. My arrival surprised my family. They had no idea I was coming. Our conversations had been sparse, as I didn't want to dwell on what I had lost. But my homecoming turned out to be a celebration. The very next morning, my parents called up all the relatives, and they organized a big party for that Saturday afternoon. Over coffee, they filled me in on what had happened to Annie after I left. She had struggled profoundly, refusing to eat and even attempting to take her own life. The doctors discovered she was pregnant, which explained a lot. Meanwhile, George and Sue had reached out to my parents, hoping to contact me to share the news that I was going to be a father. My dad, trying to manage the situation diplomatically, requested a grandparent DNA test, since they hadn't been able to get in touch with me for so long. To George's relief, he agreed to the test, and once the baby was born, they confirmed it: I wasn't the father. The revelation left George and Sue almost speechless. In the aftermath, I learned that my marriage to Annie had ended in divorce. She had refused to take any of the money I had saved, which continued to sit untouched in the bank. After the baby arrived, I was informed that he had a full head of black hair, just like Tom. George stepped up and married Annie, embracing fatherhood. They had been married for nearly 4 years and welcomed 2 more children into their family. They had a house of their own, and George was doing well enough at his job. Annie was a stay-at-home mom, and from what my parents told me during those few encounters, she seemed genuinely happy. To my surprise, George and Sue showed up at the party. My parents had invited them, and I welcomed the chance to speak with them. We shared a heartfelt conversation, reflecting on the past and the unexpected turns our lives had taken. It felt strange yet comforting to reconnect, even amidst the complexity of our shared history. Annie was known around town as a happy mother, devoted to her 3 kids, but her marriage to Tom was a different story. Tom had a wandering eye and a knack for bringing home surprises that no one wanted. Despite the betrayal, it seemed Annie was going to stick by him. Deep down, I knew what others were whispering: she was damaged goods, and who would want her now? Her family even expressed relief that I had moved on. They mentioned how proud they were of my success. They didn't know I was doing better than they imagined, not rich, but certainly comfortable. Still, they missed the connection we once shared. One afternoon, I was at a local deli, enjoying a sandwich while catching up on work. I looked up and was taken aback when I locked eyes with Annie. She was there with her kids, and her expression was a mix of surprise and uncertainty. I had long since let go of my anger, so when she approached, it felt like watching a deer cautiously approach a meadow. I invited her to sit, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted. We talked easily enough, but when she tried to explain her situation and offer apologies, I cut her off. I didn't want to revisit the past, and I could see the frustration building in her as she tried again and again to make sense of it all. Finally, I threatened to leave if she didn't drop it. After that, the mood lightened, and we had a pleasant lunch together. Her kids were delightful, especially the oldest boy, who ended up sitting on my knee as we laughed and shared stories. But then Annie looked at her son, tears brimming in her eyes, and said, "He should have been your boy. This should have been our life together." I smiled, feeling the weight of those words, and replied, "I've always dreamed the same thing." That seemed to be the final straw for her. She abruptly gathered her children and diaper bag and dashed out, leaving me alone with my thoughts. A year later, I found myself in a new chapter. I had gotten married, to the college student who was living in my rental house. My parents had asked me to help her find a new place since they had kept the rent low so she could afford it. We had struck up a friendship, and it gradually blossomed into something deeper. I eventually left her in the house, and we began dating. After a few months, we both knew it was true love. I hadn't proposed, maybe I should have, but I didn't. Jannie had no idea she was marrying a man who wasn't struggling as much as she thought. To her, I was just a guy hopping from job to job across the country, with nothing to show for it. In reality, I had a stable life and some financial security. She believed I was still living at home with my parents, just a drifting soul. A few months into our marriage, Jenny confronted me, worry etched on her face. "Are you planning to look for a long-term job?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. She feared I might leave for a long time, leaving her alone. That moment was a turning point, and I realized I needed to show her that I was committed, not just to our life together, but to building a future that we both could rely on. I had a great time sitting down with Jenny to share some exciting news. I explained that I had managed to save a bit of money, enough to keep us afloat for a while. Her expression changed from curiosity to concern as she asked what we'd do when the money ran out. She had her teaching certificate but hadn't been able to find a job nearby. Most of the positions she found would require us to move quite a distance, which wasn't ideal. Then I decided to have a little fun. I took a piece of paper, wrote a number on it, and flipped it over so she couldn't see. The look on her face was priceless when she asked what I was doing. I casually told her it represented the amount in my checking account, and I thought it might help us for a bit. "Can I see it?" she asked tentatively. I pretended to hesitate, acting like I was worried about revealing it. Finally, I slid the paper across the table, and she slowly turned it over. Her eyes widened in surprise as she looked up at me, excitement bubbling over. She was thrilled to see that I had such a cushion in my account. Despite her small house, we didn't have a mortgage, and while I didn't have a car or truck yet, her little vehicle was fully paid off. We decided to celebrate the good news, and as we laughed and enjoyed each other's company, I could see the worry melting away from her shoulders. A week later, after I'd been working in the garden, I came inside to find Jenny waiting for me. She looked anxious as she called out my name. "I checked our account, and I think there's been a mistake. You need to call the bank. Someone must have deposited extra money in there." When I chuckled at her concern, her expression turned puzzled. "What's so funny?" she asked, frowning. I explained, "It's an automatic deposit, it's the first of the month." Her confusion deepened, and without another word, she grabbed her jacket and headed out for a walk, saying she needed some time alone. When she returned, I was back in the garden, and I noticed she was still processing everything. She sat down quietly and watched me work for a while. I finally turned to face her and took in her expression. The shock was still visible, and I could see she was grappling with the reality of our situation. That evening, we decided to go out for dinner. Just as we settled into our seats, I spotted Tom and Annie across the room with their kids. My heart raced. I wasn't sure if they knew I was married, but it was the first time I had been out with Jenny and seen them together. I pointed them out to Jenny, who glanced over but quickly turned her attention back to me. She knew who my ex-wife was from photos and had heard the story, but this was the first time she had actually seen Annie in person. Our town wasn't very big, but neither of us were big on going out. We usually preferred quiet evenings together. Before our food arrived, Jenny excused herself to the restroom. As I sat there, lost in thought, I suddenly realized that Annie wasn't sitting with her family anymore. A wave of unease washed over me. I trusted Jenny completely, but the thought of a possible encounter made me anxious. I could feel my heart racing as I waited for Jenny to return, hoping the night would go smoothly. I didn't want any surprises, especially not with the ghosts of my past looming so close. I hoped that whatever happened, our evening would remain just between us, free from any interruptions. When Yanni returned, she didn't say a word, but there was a smugness in her expression that made my stomach twist. I glanced over and spotted Annie sitting with her family, her eyes puffy and red. It was clear she had been crying. Just a few minutes later, they paid their bill, and as they walked past us, Tom shot me a dark glare. Tears were still streaming down Annie's face as she walked by, not even glancing in my direction. Jenny leaned over to me and whispered, "I saw Annie slip out to the restroom, and I couldn't help myself." I went in and introduced myself. I told her she'd never know what she'd thrown away. She paused, as if weighing the rest of the conversation in her mind. But honestly, I didn't catch what else was said. I didn't want to know. I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and indifference. Annie was my past, and Yanni was my future. Over the next few years, Yanni and I built a life together that I had once thought impossible. We welcomed 2 beautiful children, a son and a daughter. Our home felt vibrant and full of laughter. We lived in the same cozy house, drove the same reliable car, and I found fulfillment in my job while Yanni taught at the local high school. I drove my old Chevy pickup, a symbol of my hard work and practicality. Life was good. Even during the summer months, when many families went off on grand vacations, we chose to stay home, taking care of our little house and making memories together. We had little need for extravagance, the simple joys of family life were more than enough. As for Annie and Tom, well, I had long since let go of any bitterness. I realized that revenge is best served by living well. Every day I woke up grateful for the life I had with Yanni and our kids. I could see Annie's tears from that day in my mind, but they no longer held power over me. Instead, I focused on the happiness we had built together, and in that, I found my peace.